Let us pray. Almighty God, we ask your blessing on our Bible study this morning. Bless us as we begin a new month and send your Holy Spirit to be with us as we read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest the Gospel according to Matthew. All this we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, we are continuing St. Matthew's Gospel. I'm pretty sure that we have not watched the last video from the two professors at Yale. Did we watch that last week or the week before? I don't think we did, right? There's one left of those. So I was gonna start with that and then jump into chapter 27, which we started last week. I think that they would give us some info as before we read it. So I hope that's okay with everyone. I'm going to share my screen.
Well, now, Harry, we finally turn to the story that we've been building up to for so long now in Matthew's account, the Passion and the Resurrection. In our churches today, we so often conflate the various accounts that we find in Scripture. So help us tease out, what are some of the differences between Matthew's version and those we find in the other Gospels?
Right. In connection with the Passion and Resurrection stories, there is a lot of commonality. The evangelists, all of them, including John, who has some really interesting differences, they all seem to be operating from the same general template. But it's interesting to look at some of the little tweaks that they make to that template to see what their major concerns and interests are. In Matthew, in chapter 26, we have the story of the anointing of Jesus as a foreshadowing of what's going on. We have the conspiracy of the high priests. They all seem to be the villains here. Matthew is going to be very much concerned about who is responsible for the death of Jesus in a way that's even more pronounced than the other Gospels, and spins it in a very particular way.
That was something I wanted to ask you about, actually. So we have this very famous and difficult verse in terms of who's responsible for Jesus' death, and that's Matthew 25:27, the so-called blood curse, where they say, "His blood be upon us and on our children." What do you make of that verse?
It's 27:25.
I'm sorry, 27:25.
But in any case, there it is. And I think you need to put this into the context where you also have a portrait of Pilate and his judgment on what's going on with Jesus. He washes his hands of things, and there's the
his
wife has a dream by night and says the man is innocent. So there are a lot of signals saying the Romans really weren't interested in having Jesus killed. It really was a matter of the Jewish leadership, and they're responsible. And this particular verse, 27:25, which has had a very sorry history in the history of Christianity as a major text of anti-Jewish sentiment, really I don't think was meant by Matthew. For all of his polemic against the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders elsewhere, he still wants to affirm the Jewishness of Jesus and the Jewishness of what he's up to. One way of framing Matthew is as an alternative version of the Jewish tradition rather than a rejection of Judaism. So what does he mean here in chapter 27:25 when the people said, "His blood be on us and our children"? I think Matthew is operating with the same theological framework that he would have learned in Shabbat school, reading Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomic histories of ancient Israel. He's confronted with the fact, and we've pointed to this before and saw some of the parables in the previous chapters that point to this reality, that the temple has been destroyed. The temple, which was supposedly the place where God, or God's name, dwelled. The temple, which was the focal point of Jewish religious life, is no more. And it's a cause for lamentation, as was the destruction of the first temple that gave us the book of Lamentation in the Old Testament. And along with the destruction of the temple then comes the question of why did that happen? How can a good and just God allow something like the place where his name dwells to be obliterated in this way? And the ancient biblical tradition had an answer for that. Basically it was, we sinned, therefore we got punished. That's the answer we find in those biblical texts that I mentioned. It's the answer that we find in contemporary text reflecting on the destruction of the Second Temple by Jews. So Josephus, the Jewish historian, writing after the destruction, says, yeah, the temple was destroyed, and it's because God abandoned it. And why did he do that? Because we have all these bandits that were out there running the show, and the people just did not live up to their responsibilities. So the theological framework is coming out of that biblical tradition, and I think Matthew's judgment is that the temple was destroyed because the Jewish people did not recognize the person designated to be the son of David, the son of God in some sense or other. He's not making the kind of claims that John is making, but he has high messianic claims. And he says Jesus was not recognized, and that was the fault of the people that should have recognized him. That's the message that all these parables that we had read in the previous section were delivering, and I think it's the message here. So I think Matthew is dramatically get that notion across. That is, that the people of Jesus' day, Jewish people, did not accept him, and therefore they got punished. Mm-hmm. Is that a message that we can affirm? No, I don't think so. No, and I think we can see Matthew operating as a kind of apologist, especially when he's giving us his remarks about Pilate. I think Jesus was crucified because the Romans saw him as a political threat. Mm-hmm. The high priestly leadership would have shared Roman political judgment on the matter, but they're not executing Jesus because of his religious claims. They executed him because he was a guy who caused a ruckus in the temple. They probably viewed him as a terrorist. Right. So off, the first century equivalent of off with his head, put him on a cross. Mm. And the cross was a method of Roman execution. Pilate, whom we know from other sources to be a very brutal and efficient ruler, no doubt not only signed off on it, but probably initiated the whole process. Right. Matthew,
so the washing of the hands,
I think,
rhetorical.
Is Matthew's rhetorical move to say the Romans really weren't against us. And I think that has had an unfortunate consequence in the history of this text. So Matthew's motives, I think, were not to say the Jewish people is now and forever responsible for the death of Jesus. We have a historical event that we have to explain. How do we explain it? We explain it in the way in which similar events have always been explained. We sinned. And the we here is the people of Jerusalem at the time. Okay. Now, the one little addition to that is the we no longer includes Matthew because they are out there, and we have our own form of continuation with the ancient tradition of Israel. But that's where Matthew is coming from there.
Thank you. So just to point out, contextualizing this passage and Matthew more broadly is a really, I think, helpful way for us to understand what's going on rather than plucking it out and saying this applies for all time.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to read it in context and see what Matthew was doing with it. I think it's important to keep in mind how the text has been used and used in very unfortunate ways in the last 2 millennia. And it's important to make a judgment about it, what we think about the claims being made in it and how they conform to the rest of the claims of the tradition.
Right. Well, speaking of the claims being made here, one of the interesting passages that I've sort of always wondered about is what happens at the time of Jesus' death in Matthew's gospel. We have ghosts walking around. What's going on here?
Yeah, we have people rising from the dead already and coming around and visiting people. This is unique to Matthew. There are a number of unique details in Matthew's account of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus, the resurrection of the ghosts, the tearing of the veil in the temple, and the guards posted at the tomb. All of these are found only in Matthew, and they're all serving some sort of apologetic or theological purpose. I think the resurrection of the dead is a suggestion that the end time events are beginning with the death of Jesus. However much the expectation of the final end is pushed out in Matthew, we know that other early Christians, like Paul, expected Jesus to be coming again in his own lifetime, and the final wrap-up of God's eschatological judgment and salvation for people was going to happen in the very near future. I think Matthew wants to suggest that, that end-time process is underway, was underway at the time of the death of Jesus, although it's to be completed a little later on. The tearing of the veil, that's an interesting motif, isn't it? In the light of all of this play with we're really fully Jewish, but we're reaching out to the Gentiles. The veil keeps everybody out of the inner sanctum. Once that is torn, then there's a way for everybody in effect. This is a notion that will be picked up in the Epistle to the Hebrews, where Christ has provided a new and living way for everybody, in effect, to get to the place where God's name dwells. So there's a theological point being struck there. And then the guards business. Matthew, I think, as he has done so often, is worried about claims that are counterclaims that are being made to Christian claims. Christians claim that there was an empty tomb, Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Counterclaim was, the body was stolen. Matthew says, no, couldn't have been stolen, there were guards there. No one else knows about the guards, only Matthew. But I think he's responding to that claim, that it was a case of body theft rather than resurrection.
Sort of a defense in the way that he tells his story.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've seen him being defensive in other cases too.
Right. What about the account of the resurrection? You know, in Mark, his source, the women are frightened and run away and tell no one. In Matthew, the story is fuller. What happens?
Right. Now, the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, it's always interesting to compare and contrast the Gospels at these points, where the Passion account is structurally the same in virtually all of the Gospels, with some interesting twists in each. The resurrection account, apart from the discovery of an empty tomb, varies considerably. And so what happens in Matthew is tomb is discovered empty, people have a vision of, women have a vision of an angelic figure and a message to go up to Galilee where they will have an encounter with Jesus. And sure enough, that's what happens. That's the main point where there's an encounter with Jesus, as opposed to Luke, who has Jesus encountering his disciples in the upper room. John follows the Lucan tradition. Mark, of course, and canonical, the basic text of Mark doesn't have anything. The women just go away and say nothing to anybody because they're scared out of their wits. But in Matthew, there's one other little twist. Jesus appears to the women at the tomb and reinforces the message of the angel to go to Galilee. This is another one of these cases of repetition, and as we've seen, when Matthew repeats himself, there's something important going on. So for Matthew, it's important to locate the main resurrection appearance of Jesus to his disciples, commissioning them, in this case, to go and preach the gospel to all nations and to teach as he has taught and his disciples have been taught. That happens in Galilee. And that probably says something about the specific Christian tradition out of which Matthew came. It probably was a Galilean tradition of some sort that remembers encounters with the resurrected Jesus there. And as Paul in his summary in 1 Corinthians 15 suggests, there were a number of people in different places who had encounters with the resurrected Jesus. And Matthew has one strand of that. But he gestures toward, okay, I know that there was something in Jerusalem.
Right. Well, to sum up, what would you say as sort of our overarching takeaways from this gospel, from this study, what we've gone through?
I think the Great Commission that we have there at the end of chapter 28 summarizes a lot for us. Making disciples is an important part of what Matthew is about. His shaping of the ethical tradition, the sapiential, the wisdom tradition, in a way to create a body of folk who cohere in an ecclesia, a church. That's something very much important to him. His outreach, this has a universal dimension. He's hinted at this all along, but that it stands in strong continuity with the faith of ancient Israel. That's the message I think that Matthew wants to convey.
And I love this at the end, and I am with you always to the very end of the age.
Yes.
Well, thank you. This has been really great.
Glad to have you with us.
All righty. Let me stop sharing somewhere. Okay. Am I still sharing? I don't seem to be. Okay. So thoughts on that before we jump into, that's the 8th of 8. So we have finished with them. Any thoughts? You're all muted, so I can't hear if anybody has it. Barbara's.
I just, would you clarify something for me on what he said? that notwithstanding what Matthew said, the professor believes that the Romans killed Jesus, not the Jewish people, as a political terrorist. Is what he's saying is he discounts the story of Pontius Pilate divorcing himself from the decision-making process, or he just finds that incredible?
Well, he said it was rhetorical, not necessarily incredible, but yeah, I mean, it's, if you're going to go into the different gospels, you have different things, and so there's I think what track he's taking is that when you get things that are unique to one particular gospel that seem, I mean, let's be quite honest, how would the dream, for example, I mean, is it going to be remembered by anybody that Pilate's wife had a dream? How does that even get to the early church, right? So there's some rhetorical stuff in there that if you're going to accept it as literal fact, that's fine, but it also brings up an issue of it is a little unusual for the Romans to suddenly get soft at that time. Pontius Pilate was not known to be soft in any other source, and so it's hard to tell where the narration and the point of the narrative ends, and the literal history picks up in a lot of these things. I don't know. I mean, that's they're part of what's going on in that discussion between the professors is attempting to deal with the reality of the history of what you know about Pontius Pilate and the Romans, and what legitimate powers they did or did not have, that the chief priests did or did not have at the time. And as they said, trying to isolate where Matthew, the narrator, is placing blame, which is very clearly in this case on the chief priests and generally on the Jewish people, and balancing that with the reality that, I mean, that video is probably 15 years old. But I think that if you followed any of the news in hip hop or basketball in the last week or two, you know that anti-Semitism is alive and well,
and has been and it's never gone away, quite frankly.
Yeah, and has been. So it's the balance of, how you address this is, and I think he said it. You have to make a judgment on how, is this is the polemic a Matthean narrative thing, or is he narrating actual fact in terms of Pilate's wife having a dream, Pilate washing his hands, the crowd saying his blood be on us and our children. Those are a lot of details that go out of their way to paint a picture that it's not Pilate, it's the chief priests and the people. And there are a lot of personal details that would be a little tricky to have, unless Pilate's wife became a Christian, it's pretty hard that you get that particular thing, right? It's not all that different than if you plunk together the birth narratives of Jesus from Matthew and Luke, and they don't match up, right? Like, there's some common elements, but they don't exactly match up. If you match up the passion narratives, and we started with this, when is Passover? Because if you ask John says it's on Saturday, right? If you ask everybody else, it's Friday. So that's the narrative itself is pushing this along, and they all have different details which have been passed down to them. I mean, Luke is the clearest in this, in that Luke says that he's not an eyewitness, but he's gotten it from eyewitness, and that other people have written things down already. So he's passing, he's telling the story of Jesus from his perspective and point in time, to his community and point in time, and addressing certain things. We haven't gotten to it yet, but one of the things that I think is great about what Professor Attridge said is, at the end, I mean, the primary thing in Matthew's gospel is, in the resurrection appearances, to make sure that Galilee is highlighted. And this doesn't show up in the other gospels whatsoever. Does that mean that Matthew's community is that the sort of thing, when you tell a story, you tell it in a way that you're going to highlight the things that matter to you and your community? And the answer is yes. So there's, in terms of this particular thing with Pilate and the chief priests, he said what he said. I think that it is a fair amount of rhetorical stuff going on there. I think also you have in every single gospel a very clear pattern of, there's a Jewish trial and then there's a Roman trial. And it requires the Roman trial for Jesus to be crucified, because that's their mechanism of death and punishment. And that is not a Jewish thing. So who's to blame? Well, there's a handover, there's a trial in the middle of the night, there's another trial in front of Pontius Pilate. And I think Matthew goes to pains to try to get Pontius Pilate off the hook. So why would he do that? And it's more to assign blame to someone else. And that has had unfortunate consequences.
From what I understand, back in those days, the fact was that there were so many wars going on between the Jewish factions that the Romans made it the last, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor made it the last line of appeal, because if they didn't have them, Jews would just use these things to get rid of get rid of their opponents.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
that's what I've.
Yeah, you're dealing with 2,000 years ago. I mean, the records of Pontius Pilate that are non-biblical portray him as a fairly brutal and standard Roman governor leader. It wasn't unusual for the Romans to execute a whole bunch of people. If you were a problem, the easy solution is you get executed. So that's, and if it means that when we get into this, you'll see that there's this back and forth between Pilate and the crowd about releasing, which Jesus are you going to release? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus of Nazareth, right? So we'll see some of this. Barbara, I don't know if that answers that question, but it's the narrative is the narrative. I mean, each narrative is its own, and it's hard to, we all bring together all the different elements, which allows for a more full picture, but it also waters down some of the clear agendas in each of the different gospels, and brings into play that doubling or confusion over when events happened when you bring all the different gospels together. We're coming into Christmas. In Advent, read Matthew's narrative and Luke's narrative, and if you can tell me where Joseph started off, I'd be thrilled, because in one gospel it seems that he starts off in Bethlehem, and in the other one he starts off in Nazareth, right? And they both use very different things to illustrate that. In John's gospel, it starts with the flipping over of tables in the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's much, much later. Did it happen twice? Or are they just narrating it differently?
Matt, I appreciate your words. I don't think I ever realized that the origin of and maybe I'm just saying the wrong thing anyway, of anti-Semitism was this passage in Matthew, gave Genesis, or at least was part of that. And I think I guess I just never knew that, And I remember Randy saying in one of his sermons, he said, the Jews didn't kill Jesus, we did. He said, we all did. And, you know, because it's hard to explain how we continue to have anti-Semites living around us.
It's alive and well. Anti-Semitism is alive and well. And I think the thing that Professor Attridge said that is probably most useful is, did it make sense in his day, Matthew's day, to assign blame? Yes. It made sense because he's writing to a particular, he's a Jewish person who has left the Jewish community, right, and become a Christian, and but they still consider themselves the true Jewish community. It doesn't make sense once you get out of that to start taking and assigning blame, and it certainly doesn't make sense to assign blame 2,000. I mean, to a community that has literally had nothing to do with this in any way, shape, or form. It would be like assigning blame to the Romans now and being like, we don't like anybody that lives in Rome or something like that. It just doesn't make much sense. And this is not the genesis of anti-Semitism, but some of these verses have been taken, and as Professor Attridge said, have a sorry history, right? Because they have been used again and again, because they're useful proof texts in a negative sense, right? It's a useful thing to say, well, if Pilate washes his hands, he had nothing to do with it, right? How many times have you heard the phrase, I'm washing my hands of this, right? Like, this is not my problem anymore. I want nothing to do with this. The phrase, his blood be on us and our children, has been used well, so it goes through generations, right? There's a whole discussion when I was at General Convention this past year, and that crept into our diocese too from the last convention, around trying to find ways to address anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism in our lectionary texts, so that when they come up, it's, how do you address them, right? Do you not read the text? That to me is a mistake, right? The second you start not reading something, or do you retranslate it in some way? Again, I think that's a mistake if you're sort of fudging the translation. But is there a way to make sure that certain texts are not, lumped together so that it doesn't over accentuate an anti-Semitic viewpoint, or the other one is a supersessionist, which is, that Christianity supersedes and completely replaces Judaism, and it must be stamped out kind of viewpoint, which people have too. And so the conversation on the church level is alive and well too, in large part because anti-Semitism is alive and well. And how do you begin to address it so that on Palm Sunday, when we read this passage, right, every 3 years, that people don't walk out thinking, well, that was the Jews' fault, right? Does it mean that every third year on Palm Sunday I have to preach or at least reference this and say this is a context thing, and that maybe, I don't know. Maybe you write it in advance. So anything else, anybody? All right, well, let's actually read this passage and see what we can do. Okay. Can you see my screen? Yes, no, maybe. All right. So let's start with Pilate. Sherry, you're on top of my screen, so I'm going to start with you.
So start with question by Pilate.
Yeah, and I think we read this last time, so just read this, and if anybody has any questions on it, we'll just move to the next part. But yeah.
Jesus was brought before the governor. The governor said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "That's what you say." But he didn't answer when the chief priests and elders accused him. Then Pilate said, "Don't you hear the testimony they bring against you?" But he didn't answer, not even a single word. So the governor was greatly amazed. It was customary during the festival for the governor to release to the crowd one prisoner, whomever they might choose. At that time, there was a well-known prisoner named Jesus Barabbas. When the crowd had come together, Pilate asked them, "Whom would you like me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ?" He knew the leaders of the people had handed him over because of jealousy. While he was serving as judge, his wife sent this message to him: "Leave that righteous man alone. I've suffered much today in a dream because of him." But the chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and kill Jesus. The governor said, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" "Barabbas," they replied. Pilate said, "Then what should I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." But he said, "Why? What wrong has he done?" They shouted even louder, "Crucify him." Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere and that a riot was starting, so he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It's your problem." All the people replied, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus whipped, then handed over to be crucified.
Great. Okay. So this first part that we read last week mirrors quite closely the Sanhedrin trial the night before, where Jesus basically doesn't say anything, right? And then we get the actual death sentence and trial. It's worth noting that the guy's name in Matthew is Jesus Barabbas. I think in the other Gospels he's just called Barabbas, but Bar is son, Abba is father. This guy's name is basically some variant of Jesus, the son of the Father, which is that a historic name? Who knows? But it's an interesting coincidence, right? That you've got the Son of God, the Son of Man, Jesus, and then this other Barabbas, and I think in the other Gospels, he's in prison, and that gives you the reason, right? Which is for insurrection and murder, right? So he's got he's not just a well-known prisoner, but he's somebody who is notorious, shall we say. And from the beginning of this, you have stuff that behind the scenes stuff that when we were just talking a minute ago of how would Matthew know, how would Matthew know that Pilate knew that the leaders of the people had handed him over because of jealousy? I mean, that's a narrative detail that's going pretty deep into the Roman governor's head, right? So something to think there, and it does set this particular scene up in terms of assigning blame to some degree. And then the next thing you get is the scene with Pilate's wife. She knows from a dream that he's righteous, and then so you get the stage is kind of set with Pilate is getting, and his wife is getting painted in a way that is probably more positive if you'd read the other Gospels than you might expect, right? That's one way of thinking about it. And so as you go through, there's this back and forth over, do you want Barabbas or do you want Jesus who's called the Christ? They want Barabbas. What do you want to do with Jesus? Crucify him. There's standard doubling in Matthew, right? Crucify him twice. And then the washing of hands. And this translation, I think, is kind of helpful. Like, it's your problem. And then what Barbara said earlier about what Randy had preached years ago, it is all the people at this point. So there's a positive view. And this is why I would argue very strongly that not reading these passages in church is a big mistake, because it has been, this verse right here has been used in anti-Semitic ways for 2,000 years. But you can also view it positively. And the letter to the Hebrews, which our professors mentioned briefly, does this, is that it's through the blood of Jesus that we are all saved. And so it's a positive thing, even though it may be, it's sort of an unexpected prophecy in a sense, right? If you say, oh, his blood be on us and on our children, from a Christian perspective, that's actually a good thing. It has been used as an anti-Semitic verse. So there is a positive that can be preached on this, which I think is worth noting. I mean, every time we celebrate the Eucharist, we talk about Jesus's blood being shed for us for the sins of the world, right? So this kind of lines up with that pretty well, for what it's worth. Any other things on this at all?
Can I also put in the, let his blood be on us? I mean, isn't really, if you go back, isn't the us kind of also all of us? Because there weren't any Christians at the time. That's what we all basically were. I mean, everybody, there isn't a them and them and us, right? I mean, it's all us, so to this anti-Semitism thing, I guess in my mind, it's all of us. It's not, there isn't a break, because there weren't two. We were all, if you're going to follow the line through and say it goes forward, then it's all of us.
Right.
Because that's where we come out of.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I think that I think that both interpretations have been historically used, one to assign blame, one to note that no, Jesus's blood is poured out for all of us, and we all participate in. There is no, it's all, right? I think it's both. Right. And again, that's why I think it's always a mistake to not read a verse, because it means that you've decided not to grapple with it publicly, right? You've decided that you're the enemy, the people with the wrong interpretation, or the people with an interpretation that is out there. You've decided not to even bother reading it, and that honestly, there's a number of people that would prefer that this never get read at all, and I think it's a mistake. I think you're always better off reading it, but that does mean that you need to point to a different interpretation than an anti-Semitic one, and note that the anti-Semitic interpretation is not only not correct, but it's wrong. So, all right, anything else on this?
I was just going to say, I wonder sometimes about this sort of thing, because I mean, personally, nobody ever taught me to hate or dislike any one person or group of people. But I do find, and I've noticed this with other people, that if you have certain negative encounters with certain groups of population and such, it can bring this out into the open and get people like this. I mean, I knew somebody who was a fireman who disliked the Jews. He said they were all communists and such. And he said the other thing was, he had one encounter where he and his fellow firefighters were in uniform and they were walking across Central Park, and protocol dictated that when the flag was being raised and you were in uniform, you had to stop and salute it. And he and his fellows firefighters did. And he said some of these Jews were yelling, "Oh, look at those dorks, look at those dumb dorks," or something like that. And he got him upset.
Yeah.
And he had some other negative encounters which influenced him in that way.
Right. Well, I think we've all had negative encounters with all sorts of people, but it gets into once you start going down the road of attacking anybody or hating anybody as it becomes problematic. But this is I think this is on a different level, because it's using the primary, for Christians, the primary the heart of the story about Jesus, right, which is his crucifixion, and turning it into a sledgehammer to attack Jews. And that is there's no other group that's been attacked in the same way, with like, so, which is worth noting. So it's yeah, it's got a sorry history. And again, if you I am not a Nets fan, but it is hard to like avoid news about how the NBA and Kyrie Irving are, anti-Semitism in this movie and all this other stuff. And it's been interesting that there still has been a refusal to apologize, even though they've donated some money and this and that. So I mean, and that doesn't even get into violence that's happened. It's just it's alive and well. And this is one of those passages that has played a role in it, because it's so easy to pluck out a verse here or there. And so there you go. Anything else on this? Let's move on a little bit to okay. Soldiers mocking Jesus. JD, do you want to read that? You're muted though.
The governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's house, and they gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a red military coat on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They put a stick in his right hand. Then they bowed down in front of him and mocked him, saying, "Hey, King of the Jews." After they spit on him, they took the stick and struck his head again and again. When they finished mocking him, they stripped him of the military coat and put his own clothes back on him. They led him away to crucify him.
Great. So I would only say that if you thought the Romans were looking good in the last passage, they are no longer looking good, right? This is not a very pleasant thing to do. The color of the coat is different in different gospels. In Matthew, it's red, and that they're using red military coat here rather than a red cloak or something. In Mark, I think it's Mark, it's purple. And so this is an interesting change from one way or the other. Why is one purple? Why is one red? The Romans, if you've ever watched any of these movies, you know that the Roman, military cloak color was red. And so purple, when it's used, and it may be in Luke, there's another scene where Jesus is brought to Herod and then brought back. And so it may be in Luke that it's purple, but the symbolism of purple back then would have probably been royal, which is what that is about. And this is this may be Matthew saying, no, it's red because that's the colors the Romans had. It may be the other gospels are saying, let's change it to purple. It may have been purple, who knows? But the color of the cloak is different in the different gospels. And again, this gets into a detail that who's there, right? You're in the guardhouse. The soldiers are there. They're beating up Jesus. So you get this, presumably what happened leaks out, but this is one of those things where you do get a behind the scenes thing as well. The crown of thorns, supposedly, I'm not sure if it's still there, but it was you ever been to Paris to Sainte-Chapelle, that beautiful church with all the windows? That was built to house the crown of thorns. So I don't know if it's still there or not, but that's what that church was built for. And they dress him up as a king, which again, there's a lot of irony in this, right? So his blood be on us and our children. The answer is yes, that's a good thing, right? Here, Jesus is dressed up as a king, and yep, they're correct, even though they don't realize what they're doing or saying, that he is the, we celebrate the end of our church year as Christ the King. Anything else on this? All right. Patrice, can you read crucifixion?
You have to make it a little smaller. There we go. As they were going out, they found smaller.
Smaller.
Yeah, it's off the end of the page.
Okay. That's
Yeah, that's good. That's good. As they were going out, they found Simon, a man from Cyrene. They forced him to carry his cross. When they came to a place called Golgotha, which means skull place, they gave Jesus wine mixed with vinegar to drink. But after tasting it, he didn't want to drink it. After they crucified him, they divided up his clothes among them by drawing lots. They sat there, guarding him. They placed above his head the charge against him. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." They crucified with him 2 outlaws, one on his right side and one on his left. Those who were walking by insulted Jesus, shaking their heads and saying, "So you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Were you? Save yourself. If you are God's son, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the legal experts and the elders, were making fun of him, saying, "He saved others, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel, so let him come down from the cross now. Then we'll believe in him. He trusts in God, so let God deliver him now if he wants to." He said, "I'm God's son." The outlaws who were crucified with him insulted him in the same way.
great. Okay. A couple of things on this. This is, there's a lot more in some of the other gospel narratives, so it's worth noting some of those differences. I think it's in John that Pilate is the one that puts the sign, that makes sure that the sign is above Jesus. Note in Matthew, it does not say that it's in 3 different languages, right? That's also from John. We do know the 2 outlaws there, right? So if you're remembering from St. Luke's gospel, you're probably looking ahead to one of them being good. But nope, not in Matthew. They both insult Jesus. There's no good thief. It's just 2. And this is sort of, it's the buildup of everybody is insulting Jesus, right? You start with the people that are passing, but well, you start with the soldiers in the past chapter or past section, and then they sort of continue it by putting the sign above him. And then those who walk by reiterate one of the claims against him at the trial, which was about the temple being destroyed and God's son. And then the chief priests and the legal experts and the elders, same thing. They make fun of him for being the King of Israel and again for God's son. And then finally, the final straw, I guess, is the outlaws who were crucified with him are also insulting him. Again, like, we never put these side by side in church with the other gospels. But it is worth noting that this in particular does stand in contrast to what St. Luke tells us. And so there's different narrative tools going on here for what that's worth, which is, I think, important to keep in mind. Anything on this crucifixion section? Okay, let's stop. It's 10 of, and I think next time we can hopefully finish this, unless you want to read this last section. Do we want to read this? And then let's read this. Okay, let's read this and then we'll continue next time with the burial. Barbara, have you read yet?
No.
Okay, do you need it smaller, or is this?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
From noon until 3 in the afternoon, the whole earth was dark. At about 3, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you left me?" After hearing him, some standing there said, "He's calling Elijah." One of them ran over, took a sponge full of vinegar, and put it on a pole. He offered it to Jesus to drink. But the rest of them said, "Let's see if Elijah will come and save him." Again, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, and then he died. Look, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in 2 from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised. After Jesus' resurrection, they came out of their graves and went into the holy city, where they appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and what had just happened, they were filled with awe and said, "This was certainly God's son." Many women were watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to serve him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons.
Great. Okay. So we know this, I think, pretty well. In terms of you probably know about the 7 last words. Matthew gives us one of them, which is the first line of Psalm 22. People often ask, well, why is this, cry of despair? If you read the whole psalm, it ends well. It's a prayer that starts with, or a song that starts with despair and ends with trust in God. And it's what is not in Matthew is, I thirst, woman, this is your son, this is your mother. It is finished, into your hands I commend my spirit. What else? Today you'll be with me in paradise. And what's the other one? Anybody remember? I've got 6 of the 7. But Matthew only gives us one for what that's worth. And the other gospels fill in more of that. The professors talked about this. You have this is unique to Matthew, is that the curtain temple is torn. They talked about that as a rhetorical symbol of now everybody has access to God. The Holy of Holies is now opened to all. The earth shaking, the rocks splitting, and the dead being raised, as Professor Attridge said. Signs of the apocalypse are beginning. Signs of the end times are starting. And after Jesus's resurrection, they go out and appear to people all over the city. And then finally the centurion. This is a Gentile, most certainly. They're guarding Jesus beginning at this point, and we'll see that they begin to guard the tomb later on, right? But he's filled with awe, and he confesses Jesus as the Son of God, which is exactly the charge that was against him that the people earlier were belittling him for, right? Not my God, but God's Son. So once Jesus has died, a whole bunch of things, things have changed, so to speak. And I think the last thing here is the reference to Galilee is probably intentional. And again, that may get back into Matthew's community, which may have been in Galilee, is that remember where this all started and remember where it's going to end up. So anything on this section? All right. So next time we will deal with the burial, guard at the tomb, and the resurrection. And my guess is that next time we'll finish Matthew's gospel. Mm-hmm. It will be November 10th. And I'm not around at all on November 17th because of the meet and greets for the bishop election. I'm not going to lead a Bible study at 8 a.m. on Thanksgiving Day the following week. So we will probably reconvene in late November or December and do something different. At the beginning of this, we were talking about the Psalms. We could do that. If you want to do the Psalms, there's 2 ways to do that. One is to, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad way of doing it, is to slog through all 150 Psalms, and even the 151st, which is in the Apocrypha, and have accomplished that. That may be a little long for a Bible study. Another way to do it is to pick some select ones as representative of types of Psalms that are there and do that. So if you want to do the Psalms, think about which way you want to do it. There's no harm in, you'll be an expert on them by the time we get through it if we read all the Psalms. So there is that. Any thoughts on that now? Any thoughts on anything we've just read with Matthew? Nada. Okay. All right. Well, I'll see you next week as we finish St. Matthew's Gospel. I think, anybody remember when we started? Is it that ring a bell? Let me take a look and see if I can determine how long we've been reading St. Matthew's Gospel. I think it's since when did we start? January 6th. We started on January 6th. So we will have worked through almost the entire liturgical year in order to have finished Matthew. So good job. All right. I got nothing else today. See you next week for the end of Matthew. God bless. And I'll see you later. Okay. Bye.
Mhm.